Hi, this is a response to JeffKosmo on his response to my last video about the still hard problem of consciousness. I just want to see if I can address a couple of your points there, Jeff. The first half of your video you ask, it's kind of the how and the why of consciousness, and then the second part you talk specifically about EM phenomenon, which you're championing as a kind of solution to that problem, or as an interesting idea in relation to consciousness more broadly. Okay, I've made some notes, so I'll be looking away from the camera. I hope that's not too distracting. But if I can just start from the first thing about this, what you see as a slight distinction in our interpretations of Chalmers, or our understandings of what constitutes the hard problem. You may well be right there. The quotation that you gave, which is this: how do physical things that we can see and touch, produce a phenomenon that is invisible, intangible, diaphanous and ethereal? That's kind of your characterization of the hard problem of consciousness, which I disputed, because I think I said in the last video, it's not that these phenomena are invisible, intangible, diaphanous and ethereal. It's the fact of those phenomena at all, the fact that we can see and touch. And I have to say, I think I'm not saying my interpretation is better, but I think it's closer to Chalmers. Because in the quotation that you give, he talks about the phenomenal qualities. And by that he means the sensing and the touching and the tasting. That's what he's talking about. Not some additional ethereal phenomenon, which you seem to be attributing to it. Which is why in my last video I said you were kind of gesturing towards a dualism, which elsewhere you're rejecting. I don't think that's intentional. I don't think it might be just some slippage in the language. But I think you're identifying consciousness as a phenomenon separate to the content of consciousness, if you like, separate to the tastes and the touches, is part of that slippage. And I don't think it really echoes Chalmers, at least in my understanding of Chalmers. Okay, let me just have a quick look at my notes. Okay, yeah. Just to pick up on that, and I think I'll pick up again on this in the second part. But as I say, Chalmers doesn't indicate that consciousness is this separate ethereal component outside of the phenomena that our senses and our physiology have experiences of. But I think where that does start to arise in our descriptions, and this is what I was trying to get at in our very, very first video about the hard problem ages ago, that the language that we use and the kind of tools of thought that we mobilize when we try to think about consciousness absolutely do use the kind of language of the ethereal, the intangible, the diaphanous, the invisible. Because when we're trying to think about consciousness, not experience consciousness, but think about consciousness as an entity, as a concept, it is a difficult concept to grasp for all of those reasons. It's the concept that's diaphanous, it's the concept that's ethereal, it's a concept that has this sense of intangibility about it, not consciousness itself, I would argue. Consciousness itself is the stuff of experience. Talking about consciousness is definitely ethereal, and therein lies the hard problem. I think, and I may be mischaracterizing completely here, Jeff, but I think your description about how do physical things, yada yada yada, etc., that to me smacks much closer of what Francis Crick called the astounding hypothesis, or maybe it's the astonishing hypothesis, and one of those two, which is basically, how can meat think? How is it that physical material, that stuff, can give rise to this thing called thinking, or this stuff called experience? And I think that question is much closer to the kind of question that you're answering, and it's a very closely related question. I think you can't have one without the other, really, but I do think they are slightly different. Okay, let me just see if I can pick up. Okay, I need to go into this how and why stuff, because you give these two understandings of the question of consciousness. Either of our versions would be fine there. One of which is a kind of operational understanding of that question, and the other which is a teleological question. The operational question being, what gives rise to consciousness, whether it be your electromagnetic theory, or whether it be, Penrose and Hamerhoff's quantum mechanical stuff, or whether it be, some neural correlates of consciousness, or whether it be a radio transmitter on Mars, or whatever it may be. That's undoubtedly an operational or an instrumental or a mechanical description, and we're in agreement about that. And then you have this teleological question about the why of consciousness. Personally, that's not a question I would go toward, it's really a question which belongs to theology, I would say, or possibly to evolutionary psychology if you were coming in at that round, that approach. But judging by some of the other language, I think you're coming in from a kind of theological framework. That's not really where I'm coming at this, but I don't think either of those, to be honest, this is where we part company, I don't think either the how or the why question are to do with the hard problem. The how question, the fact that we don't know how consciousness is produced, is what Chalmers would call the easy problems. They're not easy because we know the answer, but we know what kind of answers would satisfy. If it did turn out that consciousness was produced by electromagnetism, that'd be fine. That would solve the easy problem. It would solve the how problem. If it was a radio transmitter on Mars, if it was God talking to you through your pineal gland, if it was quantum mechanical in the microtubules of the brain, whatever the answer to the how question was, that would be fine. But that doesn't solve the hard problem. The hard problem is it's something else. I'll come back to that in a sec. The other one, the why question, the teleological question, as I say, is theological, or possibly, as I say, an evolutionary biological question, which is, why would an animal develop this thing called consciousness when apparently we could just as easily be zombies? Again, there's some interesting questions there, but neither of those questions are to do with the hard problem. The hard problem is hard because we don't know how to ask the question. I mean, this is what Chalmers talks about elsewhere. We don't know what question to ask. We don't know if it's a how question. We don't know if it's a why question. How questions feel unsatisfactory. Whatever the mechanism is, we can't imagine it ever being a satisfactory description. And that's something I want to come on to, because I think you are very close and really interesting there. And as I say, the why question is sort of irrelevant. Let me just have a quick look here. Yeah, you talk about this zombie, you bring up this zombie thing, and I think that's absolutely right. I personally wouldn't frame this question about whether it would be easy for a divine power or a God to create a creature with consciousness or without consciousness, because I don't work in the God paradigm. And I was a bit surprised to hear you say, given that your extensive quotation of William of Ockham and his famous razor, I don't really know how God crept in there, to be honest. If we are being true to Ockham's razor, then we would have to accept that's not necessary. We can carry on believing in God if we choose, but it's not necessary for this equation to make sense. It doesn't add anything to the theory, so it would have to go, I think. Okay, I'm just checking on how much time I've used. Probably far too much. Okay, second part, which is to do with EM phenomena. Yeah, okay. EM phenomena. Okay. Yeah, I think there is something interesting here. I don't know if EM phenomena has any valid validity at all. I don't know. It might be completely spurious. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I hope you're onto something. That's great, but I don't know. It certainly provides very attractive images. Some of the visual images in your videos are beautiful to look at. They're really lovely things. Doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but it's interesting. But you start off that section by talking about different understandings of the word physical, and I think this is really significant. Because you talk about a kind of vernacular understanding of the word physical, meaning, kind of prototypically solid objects, billiard balls, I think you mentioned, as being very physical, and other things being perhaps less physical. So electromagnetic fields being less physical. And that's how we'd kind of use it in common parlance, in vernacular speech. And yes, we do, undoubtedly. But then you say in physics, the stuff of the physical, the science of the physical, that distinction, it falls apart. There is no distinction like that. There is no equivalent to. Some things are not more physical than others in physics. It doesn't work like that, as I know you know. But the fact that we do use the vernacular quite a lot, and we probably think in the vernacular. We don't think in physics terms. We don't think in terms of empirical science. We think using the vernacular skills that our evolution has brought us to. The need to operate in a world with different kinds of objects, with different substances, some of which are gaseous, some of which are solid, some of which are liquids. So yeah, we do have a kind of vernacular consciousness, mode, if you like. I don't want to use the word consciousness. Our cognition is vernacular. Our cognition is like our language, I think. And the significance of the significance of that is, I think, that when we do talk about consciousness in the way that you talked about it and I talked about in the first part of this video, which is as if it was ethereal, as if it was something which is intangible and invisible. When we talk about it in those terms,